Among the Living. That was Anthrax in their prime. Hungry, fast, writing like their lives depended on it. Among the Living wasn't just another thrash record. It was a time bomb of aggression, humor, pop culture, all packed into this tight 50-minute rampage. Anthrax cracked into the mainstream for the first time, even managing to land a short stint opening for Sabbath, though that tour was a total mess, thanks to Black Sabbath pushing Tony Iommi as the sole original member and saddling him with Glenn Hughes, whose voice barely lasted past the first few shows. Anthrax, on the other hand, were on fire. They were writing new material on the road with songs like I Am the Law and Indians already taking shape before they hit the studio. Scott Ian summed it up later. He said, "We were on a roll in every way. It felt like we were being guided by the power of metal, and it was out of our hands. The devil was channeling his will through us, and we could not help but succeed." And that's how unstoppable it felt. By the time Anthrax was ready to record Among the Living, they were locked in. These songs were there, the energy was there, and they had no doubts about what they wanted. This was the record that would cement them in thrash history. They flew down to Quadradial Studios in Miami to track the album with Eddie Kramer, the same guy who had worked with Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, and Kiss, to name a few. This was a big-time opportunity. But we have to keep in mind, Anthrax was not looking for arena rock polish. They wanted something that sounded alive, something that had the power and the bite of their live shows. And Kramer was known to capture bands how they really sounded in a room. No frills, no tricks, no studio gloss. And that's what drew Anthrax to him. And in the beginning, it worked. The band tore through the sessions with urgency. Joey Belladonna's vocals were sharp, but melodic. Scott Ian's guitar attack was totally machine-like. Charlie Benatte's drums were just relentless. There was no overthinking, just pure execution all the way. And Scott Ian had said that they were completely stoked because here they are making their third album, and things were just getting bigger at the time. They had felt that wave around them and caught the perfect wave and were in the tube, and it just never ended. It was like the planets had aligned. But a lot of people don't realize that the drummer, Charlie, was the real mastermind behind most of Among the Living riffs. Scott Ian's role was crucial as well. He stitched together song sections, wrote bridges, and kept the rhythms tight. But Charlie was the guy cranking out riff after riff, banging them out on a cheap star-shaped guitar that Ian had actually sold him for $100. But Charlie Benante said, "I love that guitar. Every time I played it, something new came out of it." And Ian, for his part, relied on his 82 Jackson Rhodes and 81 Flying V, running them through a Marshall JCM 800 with a TC Electronic booster for that extra bit of punch. But the real secret to his sound wasn't necessarily the gear, it was his right hand. Very staccato, very intense, no room for any space or error. The whole point was to make it sound like a machine gun drilling into your head. And that relentless downpicking, no shortcuts, no alternate picking is what gave Anthrax that razor-sharp attack. And like Metallica and Slayer, they followed a simple rule for tightness. Only one guitar player tracked the rhythms. Dan Spitz, the lead guitar player, he laid down the leads, but when it came to the rhythm, that was all Ian. And that added to the precision of the sound of Among the Living. So the actual recording went smoothly. The band was fired up, the chemistry was there, and everybody was clicking. But when it came time to mix, things almost went off the rails. Eddie Kramer had this vision. He wanted to give Among the Living a big modern sound, something more in line with Pyromania-era Def Leppard. And that meant big reverb, layered sheen, and this radio-friendly mix. Anthrax took one listen and just shat themselves. Ian said, "We just walked into the room, we're like, oh my god, what is he doing?" Everything was giant reverbs and just completely blown out. We were like, oh hell no. We want everything dry, everything raw, everything in your face. Now Kramer, being the legend he was, didn't take the pushback too lightly. He just kept insisting that Anthrax needed this modern production, and Ian wasn't having it. As a matter of fact, Eddie and Ian ended up getting into a screaming fight over the mix. Ian said that Eddie's attitude was, you need to be modern and on the cusp, using all the technology at your disposal. And we were like, fuck that. We want it to sound like the record was made in 1977. So eventually Ian put his foot down, said, look, this is an Anthrax record, not an Eddie Kramer record. You get to move on and do 100 more albums. This could be the last thing we ever do. It's our album, our way. That's all there is to it. And Kramer backed off. He turned off all the extra reverb, stripped the mix back to its rawest form, and handed the band something closer to what they wanted. But still, Anthrax was not convinced. They took the tape to Compass Point Studios in Nassau, where Chris Blackwell, who had worked on Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind, helped them lock in the final mix. And that's really when the album finally came together. And Ian was right. If they had let Kramer go full-on Def Leppard on Among the Living, it would have killed their momentum. So instead, they stuck to their instincts, fought for the sound they wanted, and ended up with a record that still rips people's faces off today. Now, Ian could not believe that he actually had the nerve to stand up to one of their idols, Eddie Kramer, but realized that if he hadn't done that, the album would have just been completely hosed. And instead, no compromises, no trends, just speed, power, and everything that Anthrax was meant to be. Anthrax nailed something special with Among the Living. These weren't just thrash songs. They had character and hooks. They had an energy that made you want to sprint headfirst into a wall. And any album that makes you have a serious sore head or even a sore ass, you know that it is definitely worth the purchase. And this album was no exception. It all started in their New York practice space where they fine-tuned instant classics like Caught in a Mosh, N.F.L. Nick Ufessen, N.F.L., which is nice fucking life spelled backwards, an imitation of life. The riffs were nasty and jagged, pure speed-driven aggression, but there was always a sense of fun buried underneath. You had the Stompers, I Am the Law. Indians brought some breathing room with their mid-tempo churns before diving headfirst into full-on thrash fury again. Then there was ADI, Horror of It All, and that one hit differently. It was their tribute to Cliff Burton, who had just passed away. He had died in that tragic bus accident in Sweden, while Metallica and Anthrax were actually touring together. The song starts with a nice, mellow, somber acoustic melody, almost like a funeral dirge, before it explodes into this pounding, frenzied thrash assault. Ian later admitted that the whole album carried some of that grief. And he had said that part of the reason that song and the rest of the album sound so angry is because of Cliff had died. The bands were dear friends. Cliff was definitely a big, huge friend of theirs as well. And Anthrax were just plain pissed off at the whole thing. And this wasn't about radio hits, no grand scheme to break in the mainstream. They didn't even have pressure from the label to deliver a chart-topping single. It was just go time. They had enough songs, they hit the studio, no filler, no extra stuff sitting on the shelf. In hindsight, the band thought maybe they might have pushed themselves to write more, just to see what else would come out during that hot streak. But it was all just at the moment. They already had I Am the Law and Indians under their belt. And they were actually playing that on the Spreading the Disease tour before this one. But those songs were enough to give them confidence in their current material at the time. So after that tour, they had locked themselves in Top Cat rehearsal studios in New York, cranking out most of the remaining tracks before heading to Europe with Metallica. I Am the Law, for example, borrowed riffs from Spreading the Disease sessions. Imitation of Life had contributions from their original bassist, Dan Lilker. But by the time they were done, everything sounded fresh, furious, and distinctly Anthrax all the way through. And lyrically, Among the Living was a perfect reflection of Scott Ian's obsessions at the time. Horror, comic books, a healthy dose of real-world frustration. Caught in a Mosh, one of the most famous thrash anthems of the time, inspired by their roadie getting unwillingly swallowed up in a mosh pit. And Indians, of course, stood out, not just for its galloping riffs and that full-on explosive chorus, but it had a really strong message as well. At the time, thrash metal wasn't exactly known for its social commentary, but Scott Ian definitely had something to say, and it had taken direct aim at how history had whitewashed the treatment of Native Americans, painting this picture of mutual respect, reluctant wars, when in reality it was a whole hell of a lot worse. And that was inspired lyrically from when Scott Ian was in school, where he would get this whole warped view of history, where they talked about the mutual respect, how we all learned from each other, when really it was just straight out genocide all the way. And of course, what really set him off was an article in Time magazine detailing the rampant alcohol and drug problems on modern reservations, and of course, people putting themselves through much worse. And it wasn't just history, it was just ongoing. And that's what the lyrics were not shy about calling out. And it was kind of like Anthrax's answer to Iron Maiden's Run to the Hills, another metal anthem about the European conquest of Native American lands. But Ian shot that one down immediately. He said, no disrespect to Maiden, but why would I need an English band to teach me about my own country's heritage? He went on to say that musically they owed a lot to Maiden, but lyrically, never. And of course, then you had One World, which covered the nuclear war paranoia that loomed over every metal band in the 80s. And then there's I Am the Law, inspired by Judge Dredd, one of the most violent and badass comic book anti-heroes, and it served as his own thrash soundtrack. And then you had Skeleton in the Closet, based on Apt Pupil, Stephen King's story about a teenager who discovers his neighbor is one of those scumbags. You know the type, originally from Germany. Among the Living, inspired by The Stand, King's apocalyptic masterpiece, also became the title track, of course. Now, Anthrax wasted no time hitting the road after Among the Living dropped. First, a quick turn through Japan, but the real tour kicked off May 26, 1987, at the Penny Arcade in Rochester, with Metal Church opening. It was the start of a relentless cycle, mid-sized venues in the US through the summer, and then straight into Europe. And then came Donington. On August 22nd, 1987, Anthrax found themselves on the Monsters of Rock festival bill at Castle Donington, sharing the stage with Bon Jovi, Dio, Metallica, Wasp, and Cinderella. And the crowd was huge, 80,000 people. You got to keep in mind, for a band that just a few years before that had only been playing tiny clubs, it was definitely a surreal moment for them. After Donington, the European tour took them through venues packed with 7,000 screaming fans a night. And when they got back to the US in November, they were headlining 5,000 plus seaters with Celtic Frost as support. It was clear, Anthrax wasn't just another thrash band grinding it out in the underground. They were now definitely in the big time. By early 1988, even Kiss had taken notice, inviting Anthrax to open for them on the Crazy Nights US tour. Now that was one hell of a strange pairing. Kiss themselves were in the midst of the lipstick, eyeliner, hair metal phase, and they did not pull it off as well as other hair metal bands for sure. But for Anthrax, it turned out to be a huge boost in exposure, and that's exactly what they needed. The tour wrapped up in April 1988, and just like that, it was time for the next album. Anthrax went straight into the studio to record State of Euphoria, barely stopping to catch their breath. But all the miles and intensity took a toll. By the time the dust settled, lead guitar player Dan Spitz was gone, walking away from the group seemingly for good. Scott Ian, looking back at it all, was blown away how they went from this unknown act to selling out these 6,000, 7,000 seat venues, saying that they had no idea how it happened because they never stopped to think about it. It was always just go, go, go. Album, tour, album, tour. It was a lot of work, but definitely paid off. And of course, Scott being obsessed with horror, comics, and sci-fi, it just poured out of him in these songs. He was really into Stephen King, especially The Stand, and he had said that it was actually a big part of his life. And the ultimate mixture in music is real-life rage and total nerd, which created the perfect combination for Among the Living. Slayer had Rain in Blood, pure evil incarnate. Metallica had Master of Puppets, that dark, sprawling masterpiece with some seriously tight riffage. Megadeth had Peace Sells, but who's buying? Furious, political, and paranoid. And Anthrax, they had Among the Living. A record just as pissed off, just as fast, but with a sly grin buried underneath it. Like a thrash metal comic book come to life. By the time Among the Living landed at number 62 on the Billboard charts, Anthrax had officially kicked the door in. Thrash diehards already had their eyes on the band, but now a new wave of fans was getting hooked. Ones drawn in by the perfect storm of Joey Belladonna's soaring vocals, and of course the unrelenting sonic assault behind him. It wasn't just heavy, it was infectious. And the album kept growing in stature long after its release. It sold steadily over the years until, on July 31st, 1990, Among the Living was actually certified gold. And by then, the album had already done its job, landing Anthrax into the ranks of the Big Four, standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the biggest bands of that time. The album made their career, and the critics dug it as well. Everybody from Encyclopedia Metallum to Metal Reviews, BBC Music, Rolling Stone, Classic Rock, all really dug the technical agility that went into this album in particular. And also the band was a bit of a fresh air as well. Unlike their leather-clad peers, they favored long shorts, goofy t-shirts, and a healthy dose of humor. But decades later, Among the Living has not lost a single ounce of its fire. Songs from the album remain live staples with at least 4 tracks consistently in their setlist since 1987. They revisited the album multiple times in its entirety, during the 2005 reunion tour with Belladonna and Spitz, again in 2013 for the Metal Alliance tour, and in 2017 for the album's 30th anniversary. It earned them a place in Decibel's Hall of Fame, 2005. Listed in 1001 albums you must hear before you die, 2006. And even now, decades later, the album still rips. Scott Ian said that it's a classic, and he knows what it meant to the scene, but more importantly, he really appreciated what it did for the entire band. Some records age, some records define. Among the Living did both. So to my subscribers, I want to thank you so much for just being frigging awesome. If you haven't had the chance to subscribe yet, reach up and give that subscribe button a good kick in the ass, and while you're at it, give the like button a good kick in the ass as well. They both could use it. Join the family. I want to thank you so much for watching.